So up to this point, we've been focusing on the technical side of digital art, but from this point forward, we're going to focus on the creative side, starting with lighting and building values. And these two go hand in hand because values are directly affected by the placement of lighting in the scene. So when we look at an object, we're interpreting the object based on the lighting that's hitting it, and then our eye starts to create forms based on the tonal contrast. So it's the responsibility of the light to indicate where the value should take form. And there are three basics to remember about lighting while you are working, and that's direction, an object's surface, and shadows. So when talking about direction, it's important to create a light source in your scene and stick to it. So you always got to keep in mind where it is and how it will fall upon your object and how to shade appropriately according to where the lighting is coming from. So the direction of lighting is very important to remember. So then next we're thinking about the object's properties. Will the object reflect or absorb light? Will it glisten or will it scatter the light? So you want to make sure the object corresponds to the lighting appropriately. And lastly, adding shadows. Because lighting is only half the task. Make sure you remember to include the shadows to really indicate where your light source is coming from. So let's break down the different parts of lights and shadows and define them a little more specifically. So when looking at an object, you should have a pretty good indication of where the light source is coming from. And most times, the light source won't be seen in the actual picture, unless if you have like a sunset in the background and the sun would be the light source. So when light does reach an object, the strongest point at which the light is hitting that object is called your highlight. Now, depending on the object's surface, the highlight might be very prominent, like in water, or it might be very subdued, like in matte armor, where it's barely visible at all. And from this point, the light would continue to work its way around the object, and this section of lighting is called your midtones. And then the light would continue to work its way around the object until it reaches the point at where the shadow would begin, and this point is called the terminator. Now, if your object is resting on a surface, there's a good chance that there will be some bounce lighting that will be reflected off of that surface and back onto your object. And that leads us to the shadows. So the core shadow is usually somewhere in between the bounce lighting and terminator and is the darkest part of the object because it's receiving the least amount of light. But that doesn't mean it's the darkest shadow in the scene. So the occlusion shadow is usually formed when two objects butt up against each other. So if you place your hands against each other, there's that black line that is created, and that's called the occlusion shadow. And then lastly, based on whatever direction the lighting is coming from, the object will most likely cast a shadow. So while you're working, it's good to keep these in mind to help indicate where the light sources are coming from, which will in turn make your subject matter look like it has more form and value. So now let's take a look at the fact that light bounces. So when light hits an object's surface, part of it is absorbed and part of it is reflected. But let's focus on the reflected part. When working with bounce lighting, you have to be thinking about the angles at which the light's hitting the original object and how it's casting that light on the next object over. So every time the light bounces from an object to an object, it loses some of the brightness that the original light had. And if the reflected object's surface had some color to it, like in this example, some of that red from the pot will be reflected onto the gray sphere. But that doesn't mean that bounce lighting should be used everywhere, but only where it's appropriate and if the object's surface calls for it. So now let's talk about setting up a lighting scene. So a great scene setup that's done by many concept artists, especially for character art, is called a three-point lighting system. And this lights the character in the most efficient manner using three very distinctive lights to light up your character. Now the first light that we're going to add to our scene is the key light, and this is our main source of lighting, and it's usually overhead and at a slight angle. And you can think that the key light is meant to show off the character and what they're wearing. And the brightness is usually about at mid-intensity. So the second light that we're adding complements the key light, and this is called the fill light. So this controls the contrast and softens the shadows. So it's similar to a global light in the way that it gets in between the crevices and areas where there might be some harsh shadows, and it softens them up a bit. And lastly, the rim light. So whereas the fill light was lower in intensity, the rim light is usually higher in intensity, and it highlights the silhouettes. The main purpose of a rim light is to separate the subject from the background and add that much more value to your object. And the last thing we're going to cover is how to build up your value step by step. Because values can be built up in 4 easy to remember steps, and it's all based around lighting. So the first thing we're going to do is create a base value. And we're going to build up the base value of a color, and this usually is a color identity of the object. The second step is we're going to start building up our values. So we're going to build our lighting out from where it would be hitting the surface the strongest up to the terminator point. From here, we can go in and add the finer details. So here you would add in the highlights and bounce lighting if needed. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and add shadows. So if the object is next to or standing on a surface, be sure to include the cast shadow. And that's it. So those are the 4 steps you should almost always take in building up value on an object. So thanks for checking out this part on lighting and building values, and in the next part we're going to take a look at color basics.